By the time the ocean finally revealed itself, a long silver-blue band beyond the last line of pines and low-slung bait shops, the sky had softened into a watercolor of morning light, and the hails were quiet in the car in that way families become quiet when they sense a truce between exhaustion and anticipation, when a vacation is just about to begin and the baggage of home and headlines are, for once, behind them. The road tipped down toward Seabright, a small coastal town with crooked white porches, flags that loved their wind, and a boardwalk that smelled like salt and old sugar, and Marcus watched the horizon as if it could tell him the one thing that had malfunctioned in his sleep for months, whether, at last, there might be a place where the complicated silence inside him would be overwhelmed by the larger hush of the sea. The rental car hummed, the cooler clinked when they hit a seam in the asphalt, and from the back seat came the drift of his daughter's headphones, some cloudy, layered song he didn't know, followed by his son's question the moment the first gull swooped low enough to throw a sudden shadow. "Do you think the water will be warm, Dad?" "Warm enough," Marcus said gently, and Serena, his wife, who had been watching him more than the water, studying the line of his jaw, the way he gripped the steering wheel with a surgeon's care even when he had every reason to relax, reached across and squeezed his forearm, her thumb brushing the scar that ran like the faintest thread along the darker skin there, a notch from a riot shield during a previous life of a previous month that somehow had been this year, and she smiled the smile she reserved for both reassurance and warning. "Be here, be with us, no ghosts, no cases, for once no invisible second life humming beneath the visible one," and he nodded because he meant it. In the rearview mirror, Amaya raised her phone and framed the ringing light outside like an amateur cinematographer, and Jordan pressed his forehead to the glass to count the pelicans perched on short pylons along the inlet. This would be simple: ice cream twice a day, salt and vinegar chips, the ocean on their skin until their laughter tasted like it, and maybe a book for Serena, a kite for Jordan, a sandcastle they could fail at spectacularly, a long walk he and Amaya might take in that awkward space where she's halfway a woman but still sometimes his little girl, talking about the world and its angles. In memory, there was laughter already, the promise of it, and it filled him, promising to wash clean the dull ache he carried from a case that had ended on a Wednesday with paperwork and a congressional inquiry and the way cameras flash when the world has decided to pretend accountability is enough. And he breathed in that doubled air, the smell of pine that hadn't given up yet on the sea that didn't care about any courthouse, and for a moment he could almost believe he was just a dad who was careful about what he packed. They checked into a motel that had a name promising the moon, the sea and sun lodge, the kind of place with a kidney-shaped pool and a swinging sign that moaned softly when the wind was right, local teenagers riding by in salt-stained pickup trucks, a woman in a folding chair with pink curlers in her hair smoking and reading a paperback with the cover bent back like a wave. Mr. Patel at the desk was all smile and apologies about the AC that whined before it purred and the door that needed a hip to close, and Serena, who collected the specific kindnesses of strangers the way some people collect shells, beamed at him like he had offered her a palace. The family tumbled into the room like a wave breaking apart, bags skidding under the bed, a chorus of "Where are my flip-flops?" and "Don't jump from there, Jordan, baby, you'll break your ankle," while the television tried to sell them breakfast cereal and good credit. Marcus set his leather overnight bag on the dresser and, without thinking, placed his badge and his gun on the high shelf in the closet, tucked behind the extra pillow as if hiding the future from them, and a short, private shiver ran through him, the old motion so practiced now it had become muscle memory. Sunlight pressed in through the blinds like warm fingers, dust motes drifting like sequins, the full-length curtain snapping back into place with a little drum beat, and the cool blast of air finally won the fight with the room's sticky heat. The laughter grew, the day unfurled, they hit the boardwalk early, the vendors just waking up their windows, the Ferris wheel clicking in the distance, the ocean wearing its morning face, flat as a sheet over a sleeping giant. They ate donuts warm enough to burn, powdered sugar mapping pointless constellations across their brown fingers. They took a picture in a photo booth whose paint had peeled back to show decades of color beneath. They admired t-shirts that celebrated being drunk in 6 fonts. They met an older couple from Ohio who said they'd been coming here for 30 years, and how about that? The world keeps spinning, and places like this keep staying, and it all felt, if not safe, then aligned with the unimportant version of time, which is the only time we'll ever truly own. The first sign that the world outside their intentions intended to place itself in their path was a small, easy thing, the kind of micro-interaction so routine it often slid by before it landed. The cashier at the surf shop asked Marcus for a second form of ID for the boogie board they wanted to rent, and when he handed over a credit card, the man, who had called Serena Han and Amaya sweetie and who had not asked the couple before them for anything other than a signature and a smile, narrowed his eyes just a touch at the address on the card and leaned back like it might burn him. Marcus had always thought of the moments that follow as the half-beat where you choose whether to spend the energy it costs to demand fairness in a way that will, for some watching, register as aggression, whether to let it slide to save your children, the familiar drama of it, whether to signal in some secret adult Morse code to your wife that you will be calm, already are calm. He let it slide. Not because he didn't care, but because he was stacking moments, saving his powder, building a tower of yes to the day and not wanting the first no to collapse it. And Serena understood, exhaled, smiled that smile that let the man know she understood him, too, whether he knew it or not, and they walked back into light, the boards of the boardwalk clapping underfoot, gulls arguing overhead, Amaya snapping a picture of a girl with green hair and a skateboard that looked like a painted wave. They climbed the stairs down to the beach, their skin the exact right temperature to love the wind, the water that latched around their ankles and then let go, Jordan squealing and hopping back like the tide was a puppy he had to train. Serena unfolded a towel and smoothed it carefully, the kind of symmetry that said we are a unit, right here, together. And Marcus lay down, closing his eyes half, feeling the sunlight flutter behind his lids like a bird's heart. It took an hour for the first cop to find them. He came along the beach with a slow, bored swagger, his radio cracking something that couldn't be made into English from the surf's own language. He wore sunglasses too mirror polished, a jaw too set, and his uniform looked like it had been stitched to make his chest a billboard. He scanned, as the cops in small towns often do, not searching for crime so much as searching for his place in the day, a mapping of what could be his. He paused near them, not on them, his hand on the belt that held more equipment than action, his mouth somewhere between a smirk and concentration, and Marcus felt the way you feel when a cloud passes in front of the sun and for a second it's cooler and your body tells you to sit up. He did, propping himself on his elbows, noticing the small things first, the fray of the cop's shoelaces, the slight blur along his left jaw from a hurried shave, the way he let his tongue run along his molars before he spoke. "Morning," he said, and Serena looked up and said morning back because she believes in being the kind of polite that is also defiance, and the cop nodded toward their cooler. "You folks aware you can't have glass out here?" It was a reasonable thing, a rule no one wants broken, and Marcus gestured. "Show and tell, plastic only," he offered, flipping the lid so the bottles rattled in affirmation, and the cop tipped his chin, disappointed he couldn't turn it into something else. Then his face brightened with a smaller idea, and cars with out-of-state plates can't use the lot past sunset, and that rental of yours, you'll want to remember, lot of tow trucks trying to make their quota this week," he said, as if reading a weather report but with the faint thrill of knowing something you don't. Marcus nodded, thanked him, the man moved on, and the family let out that small, held breath that has become so constant it feels like another lung. The second interaction came at the parking lot, late afternoon, skin salted and hair wild, towels shedding grains. They'd return to the ocean tomorrow, everything in oranges and warmed blues, the day dipping like the sun. One cruiser nosed into the lot, the lens of the dashcam catching dull circles of reflection off 100 windshields, and the officer inside looking like anyone, just a man with paperwork and an appetite, until he saw something he could make into something, his left eyebrow flicked up in a way Marcus, who sees flicks like that for a living, recognized as the small subroutine of power prepping itself. He hit his lights, just a whisper of color as if clearing his throat, and Marcus, who had popped the trunk and was reaching for the canvas beach bag, turned. The cop approached with the posture of someone stepping onto a stage. His nameplate said Kincaid, his face laminated with sunscreen. "Afternoon," he said, and then, "Need to run your plates," which isn't a need so much as a want unless something leads you there, but in some towns, want masquerades as need so convincingly it fools even itself, and he gestured toward the license on the rear. "Out of state, rental," he added, as if performing multiplication. Serena moved closer to Marcus, her hand on Jordan's shoulder, Amaya hanging back, eyes flicking phone phone, because she has seen enough to know the future often asks you to be your own archivist. "Is there a problem?" Marcus inquired, even voice, neutral because he is a professional at even and neutral. He is a champion of calm. His heart and his face often strangers to each other, and Kincaid smiled or something like it, said, "We've had reports of a rash of break-ins, some of the suspects are," and he trailed off, as if the next word had gotten shy and couldn't be coaxed onto his tongue, his eyes sliding over them, marking shoes, hair, a t-shirt that read "Black Fathers Matter," and he finished lamely. "In rentals," like he had tried to jump a creek and ended up planted in the mud. Marcus nodded, the smallest nod, reached into his wallet to offer his driver's license, did not volunteer more, not yet. Kincaid took it, held it longer than necessary, radio muttering behind him some code that meant nothing and everything, and when he handed it back he said, "You all staying out of trouble, now," with that rhetorical tone that makes a statement sound like a warning, like a promise, and he swaggered away because swagger is its own gravity, his lights still winking as if they were playing with themselves. Serena looked at Marcus and he looked at her, and that look they had been practicing their whole marriages passed between them. "We will not go looking for a fight, we will not become your story, we just want our sand, our gulls, our dinner." What you can't see about Marcus Hale when he is a father is also what you can't see about him when he is an agent, that the muscle of watching, like any muscle, grows and grows until it doesn't ask your permission to flex. He had seen 3 things in town that didn't add up to a narrative but had the feel of a chord. Something about the marina at the far end of the boardwalk where a red-faced man in a shrimping boat had argued in a hush with a younger man whose arms were all rope and tattoo. Something about the way an alley behind the bait shop had hummed at noon in a way alleys don't hum unless electricity has been rerouted in a hurry. Something about the unmarked van that had arrived at the motel around lunchtime and disgorged 2 huge coolers into a room whose curtains never opened and whose "Do Not Disturb" sign was never not flipped. He told himself these were not his business, this week did not belong to that part of him, and then he reminded himself of the case he had closed in D.C., the one whose photos had burned into the backs of his eyes, the one that had ended in press conferences and meetings and a sadness that would not leave his throat. It had been about a cluster of cops whose chat logs had hinted at a storm everyone thought could be contained, and he had worked 12 days straight and slept in a chair under an air vent that whistled like an old kettle, and when it ended and the cameras left, the town did not suddenly become safe, the air did not clear overnight because wrongdoing had been catalogued, and that was the truth he couldn't relax around. He did not tell Serena that he recognized the way Kincaid looked at him, the way a bad actor looks in a good play, hoping to be believed because belief is currency and power, like a drug you can swallow just by being near it. He did not tell her he had recognized the dispatch code that rattled through Kincaid's radio, a local version of a clearance call that is often a prelude to a stop they hope will cascade into an arrest. He did not tell her his knuckles were tightening again. He told her where he would make a dinner reservation, the little place beyond the pier with the cedar smoke and the umbrellas in colors you could name even after sunset, and he kissed her temple and he rubbed Jordan's head and he said to Amaya, who is the mirror of everything he loves that is not himself, "Leave your phone in the room tonight, we'll talk, just us," and she rolled her eyes the way she does when she pretends she is older than she is. They dressed nicer than they needed to for a beach town, Serena in a sundress yellow enough to catch the sun even after it fell, the kids in shirts that made them look like younger versions of models in commercials for drinks no one should actually drink, and they walked the pier, eating fried pickles that burned the roof of your mouth and laughing in short, surprised bursts the way families laugh when the whole point is to make sound together. Out over the water, the clouds gathered themselves at the horizon in a way that meant drama later, lobstermen in the distance working against time, a guitar player on the corner leaned into a song older than any of them, a song about losing something you can't describe and then finding it in someone else's smile, and a string of lights winked on above them like whoever ran this town understood, despite everything, how to deploy beauty like a weapon. They had almost made it to the host station at the restaurant when the second cruiser drifted into the white-painted curbs of the pier like a shark that had learned to move like a seal. Lights off, engine murmuring, two uniforms inside, Kincaid and another, older man with a face that had seen too much weather and liked pretending it had seen worse, his nameplate stark, Delaney. They stepped out as if to admire the view and then parted the crowd with that particular American authority that comes with a badge even when it doesn't come with wisdom, and their gaze found the hails the way a drone finds the only target in a field. There was no reason offered, no question asked, just the long look that says we are going to do this again, long enough that two old men in vacation shirts fell silent mid-sentence and a busker stopped his song halfway through the word love, and Marcus, who is practiced at reading the story inside these pauses, leaned toward Serena, his voice low but steady, an angle of a rhythm. "Stay calm, we do what we have to and we leave, I'm right here." He did not reach for his badge because that felt like too much escalation for what might be nothing. He did not reach for his words because words are easily twisted by ears that don't wish to hear. He did not move until they did. "Sir," Delaney said, a sir that meant boy or problem or public, it meant you and yours, it meant you're on my stage now, we're following up on a report of counterfeit bills being passed on the pier, mind telling us where you've been today? The question slouched wrong, too broad and not a question at all, and still Marcus offered a version of truth that was more than it deserved. "Beach, motel, here," he said, and Delaney nodded in a way that said he would have preferred a different answer. Kincaid spoke up, letting his eyes rest on Serena and then the kids in a way that made Serena step slightly in front of them, not because of anything specific, just because of everything non-specific anyone with a body understands in an instant. "Gonna need to see IDs," Kincaid added, and then, as if remembering his training like an actor hits an X on stage, "No big deal, routine." Marcus handed over his wallet slowly, Serena hers, Amaya dug hers out with the teenager's reluctant efficiency, and Jordan blinked up at the men like a kid at a zoo, that curiosity that hasn't learned yet when it's dangerous. Delaney took the cards and held them like playing cards he had been dealt by a dealer he didn't trust. He looked at the names and then, with a small squint, at Marcus's face as if the letters in Hail made him itch. "Be right back," he said, and the two stepped aside to radio their dispatch with the same energy one takes to a slot machine. "Maybe something will hit, maybe a luck that could be disguised as professional skill. While they muttered into a shoulder mic and pretended to be elsewhere, a few people drifted away from the hails the way people do when something that might turn into a show is about to start, the way people make the mistake of confusing survival with complicity. The wind gathered itself as the first line of storm came in, and the marquee of the restaurant flickered the way jazz flickers in a room full of talk. Serena went very still, the kind of still that is concentration, and said, very softly, "We should leave," and Marcus nodded, and maybe it could have been that easy, that simple, except Delaney returned, handed the IDs back at a speed that made it feel dismissive, and then added, because he couldn't resist the small power of the tail whip, "Enjoy your evening, but don't stay past the fireworks, too much traffic for some folks." And the way he emphasized some said everything that needed to be said. Serena smiled like a blade and said, "We'll manage," and they walked into the restaurant with their heads held like statues that had learned to walk. It should have ended there, aggravation folded into a napkin and left beneath a basket of cornbread, and maybe on another day it would have, but the universe had a way of aligning variables that are not destined but are persistent, and in the corner of the restaurant between the bar and the swinging door to the kitchen, a television was playing the local news sound off, captions stuttering, and a crawler at the bottom of the screen mentioned something that, despite the lack of sound, seemed to shout to Marcus's eyes, "Coastal County PD under investigation by State AG for procedural irregularities." Another headline, a small one, "Boat collision under scrutiny, no charges filed," and in the moment he looked at that, the moment his training flared to life the way a pilot flame leaps when the thermostat kicks up, Kincaid, who had not gone far, walked behind their table and let his knuckles brush the back of Jordan's chair. It was an accident, probably, maybe, but it felt intentional. Because intention throws a certain light, and Jordan glanced up sharply, and Marcus's breath did a dangerous thing, changed shape. "Sorry," Kincaid mumbled without looking, and moved on, but the family was repositioned, the molecules of the room reorganized around the event they were now trapped inside, and the rhythmic clatter of plates and ice in glasses and the swinging hinge of the kitchen door seemed to pulse to a new tempo. Marcus took out his phone under the table, not to record, not to text, but to check something he had been ignoring, a thread with his sack in DC about taking a real break, about being unreachable, a thread he had left on unread because he didn't trust himself to behave. He didn't want to be reachable, but he also didn't want to be the man who wasn't, and the dichotomy felt like a weight he had placed around his own ankles. Serena saw the movement, laid her hand on his knee, a question and a plea. He put it away, kissed her knuckles briefly, and they ate. Their waitress, a woman with a laugh that burst like a bubble, told them that the swordfish was on special and they'd thank her later, and they did, because it was buttery and bright and worth the world. In another booth, a family celebrated a 15-year-old's birthday with a cake that looked like a sandcastle, and when the candle smoke curled upward it made a snake shape, and Jordan stared at it as if it might become a dragon and save them from something he couldn't name. When they stepped out after dinner, everything had deepened: the sky, the water, the sense of stakes. Teenagers in hoodies gathered near the railing to watch the storm bruise the horizon. The first fat drops of rain left pinpricks on the sun-faded wood of the pier, and the Ferris wheel, lit now, moved with the romance of a giant clock. The first firework spiraled skyward with the thin scream that sets the body's ancient alarms ringing, and then it exploded into an enormous chrysanthemum of white fire that lit everyone's upturned faces like a single shared revelation, and everyone owed and ahhed because that's what we do when confronted with controlled combustion pretending to be art. In the blast of reflected light, Marcus saw Kincaid in profile near the edge of the crowd, the older Delaney beside him, and with them a man in plain clothes with the careful boots of someone who thinks of himself as feral. Marcus couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to read an argument in there Shoulders, the plainclothesman gesturing toward a cluster of young men near the concession stand, Kincaid shaking his head no, Delaney holding two opposing thoughts at once in the space between his eyebrows, and then the second firework shrieked into the air and took the room's oxygen with it. When the boom came, a kid on a skateboard lost his grip on his board and it ricocheted into someone's shin, and there was a momentary shoving match that could have been nothing, except that Kincaid and Delaney saw everything as something useful and moved. They waded into the crowd like fishermen into a school, grabbed the wrong boy, and the plainclothesman, not a cop, Marcus could tell now, not on the clock anyway, tried to intercede with a hand on Kincaid's shoulder, and Kincaid spun and shoved him back, and then the plainclothesman swung, and the crowd, primed on the chemistry of noise and light, broke the way crowds do when they are made of people with histories and men's hands at their backs. Someone screamed, someone laughed, someone else said don't, and the thin thread of panic began to stitch quickly through the weave of joy. Marcus froze for half a second, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he knew too many things to do. He grabbed Jordan and pushed him toward Serena, who clutched his shirt like a rope. He reached for Amaya, whose eyes were vast now, and he scanned for what would turn this into a scene that would not leave them. He could see the sequence. Kincaid would find him, use him to make the crowd smaller by giving it a focal point, frame him as the man not cooperating, the father not fathering, the citizen not citizen enough. He moved them left, away from the cluster, toward the narrower part of the pier that led to the stairs down to the parking lot, but the crowd funneled like water around a stone and they were caught in it, a child's stroller clipping his ankle, a teenage boy's elbow in his ribs, and when he lifted his head, Delaney was there, chest rising, cheeks high, his breath forming the words that could change a life. "Hands up, sir," he called, not with softness, and the muzzle of his hand hovered near the plastic of a holster like a promise, and behind him Kincaid was already reaching for his cuffs. This was the pivot point, the hinge of the night, the moment where Marcus Hale, father, had to decide whether to become Marcus Hale, agent. He did not want to make this their story, but he also did not want his children to understand, from the inside, what he had seen too often from the outside. "Kids, down," he said, his voice suddenly amplified by adrenaline until Serena flinched and then obeyed. Pulling Amaya and Jordan into a crouch against the bench, he lifted his hands slowly, palms out, all theater, every motion exaggerated to be legible. Delaney approached, the cuffs glinting, rain beginning to prick, and Marcus felt time become a machine with gears so big you can ride them as they turn. "Officer," he said, with all the respect part of him could muster, "I have credentials." I am reaching slowly into my back pocket to retrieve them. "You will not put your hands on me or my family until you've looked at them," and the way he spoke, the metronome of it, the shape of the words, made Delaney's eyebrows climb. "They don't expect a script." Marcus moved, slowly, two fingers under the leather of his wallet, withdrew the fold that held all the power he had ever wished not to need, and he flipped it open with a deliberate pop that sounded like thunder under the fireworks. The gold and blue of the badge caught the reflected light. And it did what light does when it understands how to strike. Delaney blinked as if the brightness physically hit him. Kincaid paused, cuff hand falling, and the plainclothesman, quiet now, smiled in a small, dirty way. "Special Agent Marcus Hale, FBI," Marcus said evenly, not loudly but as if the words carried their own volume, "and you will step back and you will lower your hands and you will breathe. This entire pier is under 10 cameras I can locate without turning my head, and if you make the mistake you're about to make, one of them will record it from an angle you don't prefer." It was not the first time Marcus had deployed his badge as both shield and scalpel, and he hated himself immediately and a little for how good he was at it. The part he didn't show, the part that would never live in a report, was the flash of his children's faces in the glass of Delaney's eyes, how they shined there like people about to cry, and how Serena, who knew better than anyone what it costs to be safe, had become motionless and hard, a statue of protection praying it wouldn't have to move. Delaney recovered and did something complicated in the space of a single breath. He reddened, he cooled, he tucked away the insult of being told no in front of a crowd, he did the arithmetic quickly and decided he didn't want to carry the remainder. Agent, Delaney said, as if the word were bitter but necessary, we had cause, and Marcus nodded. Then you'll articulate that cause into my phone, Officer Delaney, and you'll do it for my sack as you speak at this number, and he rattled off. From memory, his superior's cell, which Delaney did not write down because he already did not believe, Kincaid stepped forward, his face arranged into something that might pass for apology on a stage. We had a description, he said, and the intention in his voice, the oily way he gave them the gift of his regret, made Amaya shoot him a look that would haunt him someday. Of who? Serena asked, her voice like honey turned to stone, and Kincaid blinked like a man who had expected not to be addressed. Of suspects, he said lamely, passing bad bills, and the plainclothes man coughed as if to cover laughter. Marcus held Kincaid's gaze and said, this is where you walk away, officer, this is where you decide whether you've made a mistake or built a case, and I promise you don't want to know what it feels like to be evaluated by my unit while we read over your reports. And Kincaid took a tiny step back that could be mistaken for a shift in balance. They left, not because the family wanted the night to end but because the night had decided to end itself. In the parking lot, the humidity had become its own gravity, and the air was punctuated by the nervous rise and fall of sirens as the fireworks wound down. Marcus put them in the car, a flurry of seat belts and whispered words, and as he backed out, a text arrived on his phone, an unknown number that shouldn't have had his number, a message that sounded like a mouth in a bar, keep your head down, Fed. He stared at it so long Serena reached for the phone and read it, and her exhale was a thin, hot thing. Who else knows we're here? She asked, very quiet, all the fight replaced by something else, fear slender and sharp as glass. No one, he said, and they both heard the lie and the truth inside it. Everything knows where we are, now. He drove them to the motel without breathing. Not really, he could have made it on this one breath his father taught him to keep for emergencies. When they got to the room, he put the chain on the door and sat in the chair by the window with his badge on the nightstand and his gun in reach, and his wife still wearing her sundress and her earrings like a woman who hadn't yet made it home, which she hadn't. The kids took turns going to the bathroom and washing their hands and saying nothing and obeying like animals who know tonight the den is in danger. Be small. This was supposed to be simple, Serena said finally, and Marcus didn't answer. Because there was no answer that would satisfy the math of their lives. He called his sack not because he was going to blow the town up but because he wanted a line to a world where procedures existed for a reason and not as a decoration. He explained the facts, he kept it brief, he did not embellish, he did not accuse, he asked not for permission but for patience. Let me see, something's wrong here, he said, and his sack groaned because he had heard that tone before and it meant his agent was about to step through a door he didn't need to. You are on leave, Marcus, the sack said, and the words were true but the context bigger. And if you put hands on something, it becomes ours. You want me to call the state police to run a surprise patrol, you want me to note the names Delaney and Kincaid. Tell me what you want me to do that still leaves you on a beach tomorrow. And Marcus looked at his son's shoes lined neatly by the door and his daughter's phone lighting her face purple and then blue, and he said, be ready, that's all. He didn't sleep much. The rain came as predicted, a thin, steady hiss that rendered the night personal, and the air conditioner clanked to a new key and held it like a dog holds a bone. At some point Serena came to sit on the floor by his knees, her face in his hands, and they pressed their foreheads together and she said, "You don't have to prove anything to them, or to you," and he said, "I know," and meant it and didn't, and they sat like that until the darkness was less heavy, at 4 a.m. He got up and looked out through the parted blinds at the motel's pool, which glowed alien in the middle of the night, the water that weird electric green only swimming pools can be, and in the reflection on the wet concrete he saw himself as a man he wasn't sure he liked, slick with responsibility and stubbornness, too ready for the fight. He heard, faintly beneath the rain, the thud of a door 2 rooms down and then the soft giggle of a woman's voice and then the roll of wheels as one of those big coolers he had seen earlier was moved, and something in his chest clicked, the final bead sliding onto the string, the cooler, the unmarked van, the alley's hum, the Kincaid annoyance, the plainclothes man at the pier, the AG's crawl on the TV. He reached for his jeans and stood, and Serena caught his wrist. No words, just pressure. He freed his hand gently and took the badge from the nightstand, not to wear but to be, and then he retrieved his weapon, not to show but to know. 10 minutes, he said, "I'm just looking, but there is no such thing as just looking when you are made of the habit of acting." He moved through the humid edge of dawn like a shadow that had learned to be careful. 2 rooms down the door was open a crack, the do not disturb sign an insult to vocabulary. He could smell fish and bleach, and beneath that the sweet, rotting smell of something that didn't belong. He listened before he looked because listening is the cleaner sense, catches more lies. He heard 2 voices, men, younger, talking in that particular rough whisper criminals think makes them sound invisible. First drops at the marina, then the cart comes, one said, and the patrol tonight is just a number. Delaney said he'd call it in if we needed, and Marcus felt his stomach thud not with fear but with something like inevitability. He crouched by the door's hinge and angled his phone camera through the sliver the way he had been taught to in rooms in buildings far away from the smell of salt. He caught a glancing image, the open lids of coolers filled not with fish or beer but with resealed pharmacy cartons, labels bleached and reprinted, opioids like candy in a parade, a handful of vials that glittered like a packet of stars, evidence so neat and dumb it almost insulted him. He rose without sound and walked back to the room and closed the door and told Serena, very succinctly, what he had seen. She stared at him like he was telling her the ocean had a second bottom, and he saw the gears in her mind as clearly as his own. We leave, we stay and call, we do nothing, we wait until the kids are awake and then we decide. And then the decision was made for them by a knock that wasn't a knock, it was a flat-handed command, the door rattling as if the wood had a heartbeat, a voice on the other side, "Police," and Marcus did not have time to hide anything or to rehearse the speech he would give. He only had time to move his family toward the back corner of the room and put his body between them and the door. He looked at Serena, and she nodded, an entire decade of understanding in that one motion. When he opened the door, Kincaid was there, Delaney behind him, and behind them the plainclothes man with the feral boots, whose face was very calm. "Morning, Agent," Kincaid said without the mask of ignorance, and the morning made it worse that he said it like a slur. "So the text hadn't been a bluff. We'd love to chat with you about last night, and we'd love you to come down to the station so we can get our reports straight," he added, and what he meant was, so we can correct what has already been started. "I'll follow you," Marcus said, because he knew better, because you do not let yourself be moved unless you choose the place, and Delaney shook his head. "No vehicles," he said, "comes off wrong on the camera, and we'd hate for a local journalist to take something out of context," and he smiled a small smile that did not reach anything resembling a human place. "My family stays here," Marcus said, simply, and Kincaid rolled a shrug around on his shoulders that would look good on a meme. "They Won't be bothered, he said, and lying is easy if you have never had to hold the truth in your arms while it cried. The feral man, he needed a name, and Marcus gave him one in his mind. Haas leaned to look into the room past Marcus, and the motion was enough to let Marcus decide that the time for avoiding had ended. He stepped forward so the door moved on its chain in a small arc and then stopped it with his palm, keeping half the frame between himself and the hall, and he held his badge high. And his voice low, and he said the thing he didn't want to: "This is me telling you that as of this moment, you are interfering with a federal agent's personal safety. I am going to make a phone call, and you are going to step back. If you do not, the number of things you are going to need to explain will grow until it includes why you thought this was a good idea." It was not a threat so much as a list. Delaney's eyes flicked down to the chain on the door, to the shadow of Serena behind it, to the visible fear of a life he would never understand, and he took a half step back. That was the first sensible line he'd drawn all day. "We'll be right outside," Kincaid said, like a lover, and as they turned, Haas let his mouth fold around a smirk and said, "Careful what boats you fish from in this town, Fed, tides get funny," and then they were gone and the hallway made the quiet of held breath. Marcus called his sack and then a second number in the state police directory. He had memorized the way some men memorize batting averages. He kept his language bulletproof and non-accusatory, and he did something he hated: he asked for help from people who might not be ready to help. He left the kids with Serena and kissed her head as if it were a waypoint, and then he did what he had to. He went out the back and cut across the damp grass of the motel toward the alley behind the bait shop, the one that had hummed. The rain had paused, as if waiting for him, and everything smelled like the moment right before something falls apart. He crouched by the dumpster and saw the extension cords curled like snakes out of the back door, and he heard voices he recognized but couldn't place: not Kincaid or Delaney or Haas, but men thick with the bravado of nights spent near boats. He moved like a shadow until his shadow wasn't allowed to move anymore because a flashlight knifed across the alley and pinned him, and Kincaid's voice grabbed his name, "Agent Hale," like a bell, and then the click of safety off, and then Delaney's older voice, steady in a way that chilled him, "Hands where I can see them." He rose slow, palms up, as if the entire town had decided he was a seed and they would plant him where they wanted him to grow. "Walk," Delaney said, gesturing with his chin, and they walked, and the salt-baked doors of the bait shop swung back, and suddenly they were in the part of town that doesn't get drawn on the tourist maps: the rooms behind the front, where the salt gives way to damp, where the floors smell like brine and fish oil and the air has that clinical note of pharmaceuticals. The coolers sat there, red and eager, and two men stood near them, one of them the plainclothes man Haas had been with on the pier, the other a younger version of the same man, both with knives they weren't planning to use and guns they were. There is a way, in these rooms, to fill them with talk, to prevent motion by dragging time's feet. Marcus knew it and he employed it. "Do you know what civil asset forfeiture looks like when the state is actually paying attention?" he asked conversationally. "You lose the house and the boat and the bank account and the cuffs with the initials on the inside and the watch your dad left you. You lose the right to walk around town and pretend to be a hero for kids who never met one. Do you know the difference between being dirty and being sloppy? It's that you've been sloppy. Leaving a phone message for me at my hotel without a burner was sloppy. Moving coolers at night is sloppy. Trying to fold me into a counterfeit up when everyone's watching fireworks is sloppy. You know what isn't sloppy? Me. If you want to salvage anything from tonight, you will walk me out the front door and we will pretend this was a conversation that didn't happen, and then you will go home and decide, with your adult brain, if you still think you've got a retirement plan in the closet at your girlfriend's apartment." Kincaid half laughed, an ugly half laugh, and pulled a cigarette from behind his ear with theatrical disdain. "You think we run on your rules here, Fed," he said. "You think your badge changes the weather, Delaney's jaw worked like it was chewing something that wasn't food. Elsewhere, across the damp town, other gears were clicking into place. Serena, who had not waited like a woman in a story who waits, had taken Amaya and Jordan to Mr. Patel at the front desk and told him a version of it that made him call his cousin who worked nights at the county. A waitress from the restaurant with the yellow light had heard there was something happening with the cop who had put his hand on a boy's chair and decided to text a friend. Phones are balloons now that carry secrets. Across 2 counties, a state trooper named Carlin Wen sat up straighter at the mention of a badge at the pier and a phone call coming from an agent on leave. At the bait shop, the brave but dumb men gathered themselves into the shape of a mistake. Haas leaned in and said softly to Marcus, "All you've done is make Delaney choose in front of a mirror," and it was true, and Marcus felt a bone-deep sorrow for the old man that is second only to the sorrow he feels for the young fools who will never make it too old. Thunder walked out across the water and rolled into the room like a slow animal. "You can walk me," Marcus said again, "or you can shoot me and then shoot the camera over the door and then shot the camera at the motel and then you can try to shoot down the helicopter of consequences that's already in the air," and his voice had become the voice of the man he is when he is not allowed to be a father, and he hated it. Delaney's eyes rose and met his, and in them was a decade where he was the man who helped little kids learn to ride a bike without training wheels on a street without sidewalks, and in them was the day he had to bury his best friend after a traffic stop went crooked and no one wrote the half of what happened, and in them was a long, long road to here, and he shook his head. "Damn it, Kincaid," he said, and when he said it the line broke, the way ice breaks, and suddenly everything was going to move. "You brought this into my town," he said, pointing not at Marcus but at Haas and his little brother, "and you brought a Fed into my morning and into my motel and into my bait shop. You made us into something I won't be," and Haas's mouth curled. "You're already it, old man," he said, "you been it for a long time, you just liked the uniform for it," and Delaney drew his weapon and the thin hair on the back of Marcus's neck stood because guns turn rooms into geometry, but then the door banged open and the geometry changed again. Carla, when in her uniform, alone, because backup is always a little late in stories and in life, a hand up in the universal gesture of hold, and her eyes taking in the scene like a woman who sees the world in frames, her body cam a small witness. "What is this?" she said, not a question but a count, and her eyes lay on Marcus's badge and on the coolers and on the guns half out of half competent hands, and she held all of them there with the strength of a woman who refuses to be asked to choose which part of herself to kill. For a second everything hovered, and then the air rushed in. Kincaid cursed and moved too fast. Haas reached, Delaney raised, and Marcus, who hates action like a child hates a shot until it saves him, did what he had to. He shoved the coolers hard with his foot so their lids popped and spilled their bright little dead planets of pills across the floor, slippery as lies, and the men who thought they were steady were not. Shoe slid, curses, a chair went over. Carla stepped forward with a command weight in her voice, weapons down, and it was not a request. In the confusion, Marcus moved in the way you do when you have rehearsed violence and hate it, a precise step and a tuck, and he had Haas's gun in his left hand and had it out the back door into the alley before Haas had formed the desire to retrieve it. Delaney shouted, to no one and to himself, "Stop, stop." The rain began again, in earnest. Sometimes the end of a story doesn't happen with a bang so much as with a series of small, decisive clicks. This was like that. The state trooper's radio crackling, the sound of more boots, the hush that falls when men who believed a certain mythology of themselves realize the myth has slid out from under them, the quiet of a town interrupted. Arrests are not cinematic when done right, they are documents on paper and rights read and wrists cuffed without pain. Marcus let himself be moved not into a car but into a corner to be recognized and then let alone. He watched Kincaid's face as the younger troopers took him, incredulity bending into a shape he would wear for the rest of his life, a shape made of the difference between I am the law and I abused the law. He watched Delaney holster his weapon and put his hands up, himself, the way a man does when he knows he is decades too late for a do-over but not too late for a sliver of dignity. He watched Haas curse them all and talk about lawyers and make threats that turned into the kind of silence everyone else refused to fill. In the motel room, Serena held the kids and listened hard for the sound of the door, and when it finally came, when Marcus opened it and stepped inside with rain flattened against his hair and his shoulders squared down by relief, the breath she had held since the first officer had put his eyes on them released, and it sounded like the sea. His hands shook, a little, when he reached for the child, who had not let go of his fear, and Jordan clung to his father and cried in small, tidy sobs, embarrassed and not, a boy who had seen his world insist again that it had rules you could not trust to protect you. Amaya watched Marcus with a new lens, one that would help determine the sort of woman she would be, one that would record her father not as a hero but as a man who did what he had to do. They lay on the motel bed like the men in Renaissance paintings who have survived a shipwreck and found a shore, and outside, the town recalibrated. There was no victory parade, there were interviews, and there were body cam reviews, and there were threatened statements and real ones, and there were cameras on the boardwalk again for a different reason. There was a press conference from the state AG, who looked tired and righteously angry on purpose and maybe because she was. There was a story on the local news that bothered to talk to people like Mr. Patel and the waitress and the Ohio couple and the surf shop's man, and to show the way. Cracks run through towns long before storms use them. There was a photo, snapped by someone Amaya didn't know, of the Hales stepping out into the morning light the next day, their faces complicated and good. They did not leave, not immediately, because going would have meant the town exists without them whether it wants to or not, and staying was its own statement of refusal to be removed. They took a walk at dawn, the day after the storm had scrubbed everything clean and the water had that flat, contemplative smoothness that makes you believe in fresh starts. The gulls were back to their usual idiocy, the fishermen were already telling lies about what got away, and the boardwalk's planks, slick now, reflected the sky like a second sky. Jordan found a broken piece of police tape half buried in the sand like a washed-up jellyfish and turned it over in his hands and then gave it to Marcus, who did not know what to do with it and so tied it, gently, around the tail of the kite they had bought on their way to breakfast, a small rip in the wind that meant the kite would fly a little crooked and therefore more like them. "Are we safe?" Jordan asked, and Serena answered first, "We are together," and Marcus added, "We are safer than we were," which was the most honest arrangement of the words. Amaya squeezed her father's fingers like she was testing a fruit for ripeness and then pulled away because she had to be separate to make sense of everything. When the kite went up, found the clean wind at 40 feet and went taut, the thread tight in their fingers, they all looked up and saw it lean into the day like a promise that might be kept. Marcus felt something unwind in him the way complex rope unwinds in wet fingers. He had used his badge as a wall, and it had worked this time and would not always, and he knew that, and still, he let the morning light do that old magic trick on the edges of the world where it all gets softer and brighter. "You could have walked away," Serena said, not accusing, just accounting, and he said, "I could have, I didn't, I'm sorry for the parts of this that belong to me," and she nodded because she knew forgiveness isn't a door you open, it's a bed you make. The ocean breathed, large and unconcerned and wise, and the town, bruised and bragging and tired and good and mean and like every town everywhere, began another day with coffee and gossip and the occasional moment of grace. Later, much later, after the kids had been in the water long enough to forget their fear, after the weather had decided to be perfect just to prove a point, after the last of the reporters had packed their microphones into trucks that smell like old coffee and cheap plastic, After Carlin Wen had come by to apologize for the way the world had to work and to shake Marcus's hand and then Serena's, pressing her palm for a second just long enough to say, "I saw you," after Delaney had been led down the courthouse steps without cuffs because someone decided he still deserved that small kindness, and he had aged in an afternoon, after Kincaid had scowled into a car that wasn't his and had flashed a look that said he would never feel guilty enough to get better, after Haas had made bail and disappeared into that kind of small town hole criminals think is bigger than it really is, after the coolers had been photographed 100 ways and then carried away with all the other evidence that will become a story in a courtroom where someone will tell it poorly and someone will tell it well. After the sea and sun sign had stopped moaning because someone greased its hinge, after the guitar player on the pier had tuned his instrument and then, for his next song, chosen a bright, silly tune instead of a sad one on purpose, after all of that, the Hales lay on their towels in the late afternoon light and Marcus fell asleep so hard the imprint of the world pressed into his face like a stamp, and he dreamed that his badge washed up on shore and was just a shell, and he left it there, and some kid picked it up and shouted, "Treasure," and he laughed, even in sleep, and Serena watched him and thought, so this is living. When they finally did leave, days later than planned, Seabright had become one of those places in your memory where you joke about the bad things and whisper about the good things and where you can feel your family as both a shape and an idea. Mr. Patel hugged Serena as if he were hugging himself, and he made them promise to come back in autumn when the rooms are cheap and the wind is different. The waitress from the Cedar Smoke place ran out and gave Amaya a free slice of pie wrapped in wax paper and said, "For the drive," and she winked in a way that meant keep taking pictures, keep looking. The road out of town was, like the road in, the long ribbon through Pine and Bait Shop and Flag, and Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror and saw a smaller version of another man who had adjusted a mirror 1,000 times and thought different thoughts, and he felt in his chest both a softening and an ache, the complication of being alive and responsible. Serena sang softly along with the radio, a song about holding and letting go, because all the songs are about that. Jordan fell asleep mid-sentence, his head at the perfect angle to look like a painting of a boy who will become a man and then, if he's lucky, become a boy again. Amaya was quiet, her thumb still, her mind turning clothes over on a line, deciding which of them were clean enough to keep. The light in the sky did that pre-evening brightening that feels like a kind lie, and at the county line a hawk dipped low, and Marcus, who had seen 100 hawks and 100 towns and 1,000 faces look at him like he was a problem and a solution and a mirror, whispered, not to anyone, "We made it," and Serena, without opening her eyes, said, "We did," and the car hummed its delicate animal hum, and the ocean fell away behind them like a breathing they would carry in their ears for the rest of their days, and somewhere, the understanding settled. The world is a place where you choose how to show up in the scene. And sometimes you show up as a father, sometimes you show up as a man with a badge, sometimes you show up as both, and sometimes you are forced to show up at all when all you wanted was the ocean and some chips and to fall asleep in a sun-warmed room with the people you love, and that is tragedy and it is also survivable and it is also what makes the quiet parts of your life more holy than any church.